Bush administration disputing accusations that the president failed to act on warnings about al-Qaeda before the attacks of 9/11. The former White House counterterrorism chief, Richard Clarke, who worked first for Reagan and then Bush 43 and then Clinton and now Bush 41, says President Bush 41 was too concerned with Iraq and didn't address the threat from Osama bin Laden's terror network. But the White House says that's not true and that Clarke is just playing politics. Here with us from Washington now, the host of Tony Snow's show on the Fox Radio and that Weekend Live thing on the weekends. He's a very busy man. They say this is political, Tony, but I've checked, and this guy's a registered Republican.
Well, this guy's a registered Republican, but he clearly has an axe to grind at this point. Here are the two sides, Shep. Number one, Richard Clarke is saying that as the director of counterterrorism in the Clinton administration, he and other officials at the very last minute in December of the year 2000 came up with a plan to go after al-Qaeda. He presented it to the White House, and they said no. The White House is responding by saying, no, here's the deal. Richard Clarke was somebody who did run counterterrorism for Bill Clinton. He had a different job under George W. Bush. The president looked at what Clarke had to offer, and it didn't amount to much. Then after September 11th, suddenly there is this criticism after the fact, and they're saying, wait a minute, you didn't say any of these things to us before September 11th, and it does appear, at least in the White House's opinion, that Richard Clarke is a guy who is trying, A, to grind an old axe because he got demoted under the Bush administration, and B, he may have some political ulterior motive.
Let's listen to one of the things that he said to 60 Minutes over the weekend. Listen.
Rumsfeld was saying that we needed to bomb Iraq, and we all said, but no, al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan. We need to bomb Afghanistan. And Rumsfeld said, there aren't any good targets in Afghanistan, and there are lots of good targets in Iraq.
Tony, this is not a new claim. We've heard this in other books that have been written about this time. We've heard that from the very beginning of the administration that the president was looking to bomb Iraq. We've heard some describe it as a need for distraction with not a lot of good targets. Is this completely off the mark here?
No, I think it's largely off the mark. Shep, take a look at what happened. After September 11th, they didn't bomb Iraq, they bombed Afghanistan. And as Condoleezza Rice was pointing out today, a lot of what Richard Clarke is complaining about is that he wasn't in on the meetings where they were laying out the strategy. At Camp David, she said the weekend after September 11th, they rolled out a map of Afghanistan and began the planning that led to the war. The president also made it clear in a press conference about a week after September 11th that he wasn't going to engage in gratuitous bombing. I think the phrase he used was
swatting flies.
He wasn't going to take a $10 missile, fire it through, a $2 million missile, fire it through a $10 tent and hit a camel in the butt, I think is what he said.
I think that was what he was saying about what President Clinton did.
Well, he was referring to President Clinton, but he was making a point about the proper and judicious use of power. Look, if these guys were looking to make the rubble bounce in Iraq and looking the other way, then that is, of course, grotesque malfeasance. But on the other hand, it's not what happened.
Listen to what Condi Rice had to say. Now, here's one interesting thing, Tony. This came out on Saturday, and this was all over the place on Saturday. I think from a New York Times article, or maybe multiple articles. The White House didn't put anybody out. Then yesterday, the White House had the advisor, had the big press spokesman out there asking all the time. So this must have been on the White House radar. Listen to Condi Rice here.
When the president learned from George Tenet that there was no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11, the president said the next day, on September 16th, after the Camp David meeting, we'll put Iraq aside. This is now an issue of how to deal with Afghanistan.
It was Condi Rice, by the way, who demoted, for all intents and purposes, Mr. Dick Clarke. And it is Condi Rice who Dick Clarke says didn't seem to understand what al-Qaeda was or really know much about security inside the United States. Tony, I don't know how anybody on either side could say that. I mean, my neighbors knew what al-Qaeda was after these 98. I mean, come on.
Well, exactly right. Look, again, this is one of these he said, she said things, the only thing we can do, I think, Shep, is to try to take a look at the flow of events, what actually happened. Again, the president did not attack Iraq. He attacked Afghanistan. The real question is whether the Clinton team really had a plan that was credible for going after al-Qaeda, or whether it was a scattered series of what the president called fly swatting that may have sent a little message without dealing with a larger problem. And I have a feeling that these 9/11 hearings are going to bring us a lot closer to having a full answer.
I sure hope so. You know, it's important to point out a number of things, I think. 60 Minutes is owned by Viacom. The book is being published by a company that was owned by Viacom. They didn't put that out there last night. Additionally, this particular man had worked for the Clinton administration, and And when it came to the Bush administration, he was demoted. We've mentioned that. One more thing, Tony. Does it seem, and politics aside, is there any question in your mind, or maybe anyone's mind, that from the very beginning this president did want to go into Iraq, did want to plant a flag of freedom there, did want to try to spread democracy throughout the region, beginning there in a country which we felt we could get pretty easily and needed to get rid of their dictator in the first place? I mean, if you put it in that context, is this all that wrong?
Well, actually, I don't think that you can assume that George W. Bush came into office saying that. It certainly was not.
Oh, I didn't mean saying it. I meant thinking it.
No, I don't think so. I mean, you don't just go in and invade a country. I don't care who you are. And this kind of psychological theory that he's trying to make up for what his father failed to do at the end of the Gulf War, it doesn't wash for me. Presidents don't think that way. Bill Clinton doesn't think that way. George Bush doesn't think that way. The only people who think that way are folks who have never worked in a White House. I've worked there. And I got to tell you, presidents take the use of force far more seriously than that. You've seen the president, Shep. He cries whenever he gets in front of a bunch of servicemen because he understands what he is doing and he understands the gravity of it. And I don't think anybody assumed off the bat that, oh, it's an easy thing to take Iraq. You may recall in the first Gulf War, they were talking about tens of thousands of body bags. There were similar warnings about a year ago, as you and I both recall, as the war began. So, no, I don't think George W. Bush came into office saying, you know what, I'm going to settle the score and get rid of Saddam Hussein.
Oh, no.
I
don't think that that's a fair characterization of what I'm asking. I'm asking if he didn't say the whole world has intelligence that suggests that this guy has probably or is developing at very least. After all, he murdered thousands of his own people with weapons of mass destruction. He's a threat. We need to get over there and take him out, not just for that reason, but for multiple reasons, to plant a flag over there and try to spread peace, to try and fix the problems that were happening in Israel. And he even mentioned that in his State of the Union address.
I understand that, but he did mention it in his first State of the Union address. This is a president who I think came to the Bush doctrine as a result of September 11th. You may recall, Shep, that this was a president who said, in the Middle East, we're going to let them sort it out. Democrats criticized him, and I think rightly so at the time. Now he is deeply engaged in that. I think the original thinking on the part of the Bush team was he was going to plant his flag with compassionate conservatism. He was going to focus on domestic policy. He figured that there weren't the kind of foreign threats, maybe with the possibility of al-Qaeda, that he had to worry about. And I don't think it's safe to assume that he came into office thinking, you know what, we'll take down Iraq and we'll let democracy flower. I think all that came after September 11th and not before.
Good enough. Tony Snow, host of the Tony Snow Show on the radio. Check you soon, Tony.
Thanks, Shep.